Combining story elements. So once we've introduced some story elements, we need to do something with them. And one simple but useful way of thinking about what we do with them is combine them to create interesting relationships, situations, and often some sort of change. Again, fairy tales are extremely efficient at this. In the introducing story elements lesson, we looked at the opening of the fisherman and his wife. Here we're going to look at the action that follows and mark out where existing story elements are combined, as well as anywhere that a new story element is introduced. So you might like to pause this video and have a read or go over to the page on Teaching with Frankenstories and try to filter out the language and the detail and just think about these story elements, these main game pieces, and how they relate to each other. In line 1, we've highlighted the combination of fisherman and flounder. Now, officially, this combination happened in the previous paragraph, but once the fisherman and the flounder are combined, they start to affect each other. So in this instance, the fish turns out to be an enchanted prince, starts talking the fisherman into letting him go, and the fisherman agrees, right? So that's an interaction between two characters born of their combination. The next combination is the fish and the sea, because the fisherman put the flounder back. Again, we have detail about a trail of blood, but that's just an elaboration. The combination is fish plus sea. After that, the fisherman goes home. That's combining fisherman plus wife plus shack. Then they have a chat, but nothing new is introduced until the wife says, "Why didn't you ask him for something?" And it's not like crisply introduced in the text, but what's happening here is a kind of introduction, which is the wife is introducing the concept of wishes. That hasn't been in the story until now, but the wife introduces it and puts it into play. After that, we have some more elaboration, basically just developing the fish and the shack and the wish mechanics, all elements that are already in play. And finally, we get what we call a recombination because the fisherman goes back to the sea and the fish again. So these concepts of introduction and combination can be a little fuzzy on the page if you're trying to highlight things on the text and trying to mark precise boundaries. But hopefully you can understand stepping back what this means as a concept if you blur out the details and in between development, what you see are these key story elements popping up on the board and then moving into combinations, and each combination is producing some kind of result, which might be big, might be small. We won't worry about that right now. That's a topic for another time. Let's look at how this plays out over a whole 5-round Frankenstory. So the goal in Frankenstories is often to introduce some interesting elements in round 1 and 2, and then try to find interesting combinations every subsequent round until the elements are used up, which we'll talk about in a moment. For example, read through this Frankenstory about a war between a couple of old ladies and see if you can spot where key story elements are introduced and where they're combined. This is long, so I'll scroll here and you might want to pause at a couple of points. But let's go and look at round 1. The boundaries of these are a little fuzzy in text, but let's take a look at what we've highlighted and see if we can interpret this in terms of introductions and combinations of story elements. The first thing that we can see in round 1 is lots of elements are introduced at the start. And you'll find through the story, a bunch of these aren't actually reused. So we have a secret blueberry cellar, the golden cabbage, birth bath, centerpiece. These become background detail rather than functional story elements. This is typical of Frankenstories. Nobody knows where the story is going, so there's sometimes a bit of a scramble to figure out what's useful and important in the first round. We can see, though, that combinations start up pretty quickly. We have the narrator stockpiling Irma's fertilizer. We have Irma's fertilizer being used to grow the narrator's petunias. And then right here around 3, we have a late introduction, which is the idea of a monstrous petunia. And it's sort of suggested here in round 3 and then more formally introduced here in round 4. You can tell the players have grabbed hold of this because they're struggling to find good combinations, and this one has the potential for good chaos, but they don't have much time left to make use of it. The final rounds are a flurry of combinations. We have the narrator and the monster petunia in Irma's garden. They split up and go in different directions. Irma and the petunia fight in the cabbage patch. The dog's vanished in this reply. And finally, the petunia comes back for the narrator, with the implication being that it might have gone truly wild and eaten the narrator. Some of these introductions and combinations can be a little arguable in terms of where you highlight them in text, but hopefully the basic ideas are pretty straightforward. So if you sort of squint, you can see these pieces being put on the board and then being put into combinations and influencing each other through the story. But there's another interesting concept here, which is the idea of using up story elements. Stories in the Western world tend to be pretty efficient when it comes to introducing and combining elements. You might have heard of Chekhov's gun. If it's on the mantle in Act 1, needs to be fired in Act 3. So one way that we understand a story is finished is when we get the sense that all the key story elements have been combined in some way that's created a meaningful and satisfying change in their relationships. For example, in the Petunia story, the most important elements turn out to be Irma and her normal prize-winning petunias, the narrator and her mutant monster petunia, and the narrator's desire to beat Irma at all costs. The final round works as an ending because all of those elements have been combined into a new order. It seems like the monster petunia has defeated Irma, the narrator has stolen Irma's petunia stock, but the narrator's desire to win at all costs brings her to a sticky end because the wild monster petunia comes for her too. Related to this idea of using up story elements is the concept of shelving and reincorporation. This all comes from Keith Johnson and his books on improv. One of the greatest pleasures for an audience is when a story element that they'd forgotten about is reintroduced in a meaningful way. For this reason, it's good to introduce a few surplus elements to keep on the shelf that you can use later. And as you create the story, you keep looking back at that shelf to see if something can be reincorporated, even if only to give the sense of closure. Now, here's something interesting. Let's look at an alternative entry to round 5, one that didn't win. This entry right here returned to the round 2 shelf and attempted to reincorporate the golden cabbage and the bird bath, as well as Irma's dog, which is clearly using up more of the story elements than the entry that won. So from that perspective, this is a better response. So why didn't it win? We've put that reply into the lesson on Teaching with Frankenstories, so you can take a closer look. You can pause this and read it now if you want. See if you can think of an answer as to why it didn't win. I think there are 2 reasons. The alternate reply definitely combines more existing story elements. So we have a combination here, this one, this one, this one. These are all combinations of existing elements. But it also introduces a new element right at the end, the police, which in this instance feels a little bit off. And more importantly, this reply has a weaker ending. The killer petunia in the winning round creates a bigger emotional change at the end. The narrator getting eaten by their own scheme feels satisfying and meaningful. It has some kind of moral point that this entry lacks. So the point of this is combinations are a useful concept, but not the whole story. How do we practice this? We've suggested a game format where players alternate between introducing and combining elements in each round, with the last round being free-for-all. So in round 1, introduce elements. Round 2, combine them. Round 3, introduce more elements. Round 4, combine them. And then in round 5, pick at least one element or combination from the pile and try to make a quick, coherent story in the final round of play. The idea here is the combinations in rounds 2 and 4 don't have to tell a story. They can just be standalone, unrelated images. You want players to explore the idea of what could happen when 2 elements are combined and just exploring a possibility space. Now, round 5 will feel like a rush. Just know that going in. And it's okay. The point was to practice combining elements, not write a whole story. However, we found that players can get a little frustrated with that. So, if you think players are going to get a bit antsy, consider setting a longer round timer for the game and manually ending rounds 1 through to 4 during play and letting round 5 run the full timer length. Some quick tips. Players will really want to go into narrative in the combination rounds. You can allow this if you want. It might be better to try and encourage them to resist it. I think the key is to encourage surrealism, give permission for things to not make any sense. However, if the will to story is strong, you can also feel free to just go with it and let the players do what they want. Just watch out that some people in the group aren't doing one thing, trying to restrict themselves, and others are sort of having a bit more of a free-for-all, and then the 2 groups can't agree on what to vote on. And players who are just sticking with lists feel like they're losing out to players who are doing more story-style writing. Again, we have some sample games. List combo lottery is pretty straightforward. It's lists and combinations in the way that we've described and tries desperately to form a story in round 5. A really organic mess. This one's interesting in that the prompt, right, like they're going through their whole life in 5 minutes, turns into kind of a theme that's used to unify all of these random images. So all of these strange lists and strange combinations are turned into a dying vision at the end. So it sort of works quite nicely as a story, as a sort of a cheat using the prompt. And this one here, big list of mythological soup, is one where the players really struggle not to tell a story. You'll see in this one, it feels very narrative, particularly in rounds 2 and 4, and tries to wrap up in the last round. We have debriefing questions for these games, basically checking for conceptual understanding. What do players think combining is? How do they feel while doing it? Is it easy? What's hard? What's surprising? Do they feel the pressure to create a story? And what do they think of the results of what they get out of it? Were there any particular combinations that everyone tried to do in round 5? And finally, what's the point of all this? Ultimately, it's to introduce the concept of combining story elements, which is just a handy shortcut for thinking about how to start building out a story world and making things happen. It's reinforcing the relationship between introducing and combining, kind of developing mental and emotional flexibility. So a willingness to introduce and combine some bizarre things and then turn it into something meaningful or coherent. Developing a sense of self-efficacy in creative writing. So keep introducing and combining, and eventually you'll find something you want to write about. And finally, this is to help break the cycle of blowing everything up. A common combination move for learners is to just have one element destroy another, or even destroy everything. That's basically a byproduct of creative anxiety. So you can use combination games like these to encourage players to go beyond the obvious choices and find more interesting combinations and build emotional, creative flexibility that way. If you want all this summarized in note form, we have a couple of handouts. We have a student handout on combining story elements that gives the basic theory. We have a teacher handout, which summarizes the game format and the debriefing notes. So those will come in handy as quick cheat sheets. So give it a shot and let us know how you go.